WordPress Accessibility Day 2024, Improving and Enforcing Digital Accessibility Laws and Standards in Africa, with speaker Femi Taiwo, Technical Support Engineer at SIDE GmbH. This presentation was recorded October 2024.
Hello everyone, you're welcome to WordPress Accessibility Day 2024. My name is Yigafon Ipai and I'm COO from Plant Africa. Thank you so much for joining us for improving and enforcing digital accessibility laws and standards in Africa with Femi Taiwo. A little bit about Femi Taiwo. Femi Taiwo is a dedicated IT specialist with over 8 years of experience in development and system support. He's an active volunteer, contributing his expertise to the WordPress community and the broader tech community in South Africa. Femi is passionate about fostering diversity and inclusion within the industry, advocating for equitable opportunities and mentorship programs that support underrepresented groups. His commitment to community development and tech education makes him a valued contributor to these initiatives. Please remember to add your questions to the Zoom question and answer session, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. Also remember to use the chat to connect with other attendees. Over to you, Femi.
Hi, good everyone. My name is Taiwo, and thank you for joining me for today's presentation. I'm excited to share insight on this important topic, improving and enforcing digital accessibility laws and standards in Africa. As we all know, that in this digital age, it is crucial to build an inclusive digital future where everyone, regardless of their ability, can access and benefit from technology. A little bit about me. As mentioned, I'm an IT specialist. I'm currently working at SIDE GmbH as a product support engineer. I am a passionate advocate for inclusion, accessibility, diversity, and mental health awareness. I am also an individual living with epilepsy, which is something I love talking about and raising awareness for. So let's go over the agenda for today. First, we'll take a look at the current state of digital accessibility laws in Africa, with a focus on Kenya's groundbreaking ICT accessibility standard. We'll then explore the challenges and opportunities facing African nations, then conclude with a call to action for the future. So, why this topic? First thing to note is that this topic is actually my thesis research. When I was trying to find a research topic earlier this year, I wanted to focus on something that I'm passionate about. I looked through a few topics, then I thought about accessibility, and I've been aware of digital accessibility and its importance, especially as it relates to people with disabilities. Since it's a natural choice for me, and as someone living with epilepsy, I personally understand the challenges of navigating the digital world in a way that is accessible and safe. So I realized how much digital accessibility affects individuals, and not only with physical disabilities, but also invisible disabilities like mine. So I decided to go for digital accessibility. And I was initially going to focus on digital accessibility in general, but as I started my research, I then learned a great deal about how much Africa is lagging in terms of digital inclusivity. So I decided to switch the focus of my thesis research to Africa. And here are three things I want you to take away from this talk. One is to live with a clear understanding of the state of digital accessibility in Africa. And two is to learn about the challenges and gaps in the current digital accessibility laws. And lastly, to walk away with ideas on how to contribute and collaborate to close the digital accessibility gap. So let's get into it. As we all know, digital accessibility is about making sure that digital content, whether it's a website, app, or document, is usable by everyone, including people with disabilities. And this includes a wide range of challenges, from ensuring that website can be navigated using screen readers to making mobile apps accessible to individuals with motor impairments, or even ensuring content is visible to those with visual impairment. And in Africa, a continent of about 1.37 billion and a fast-growing economy, digital accessibility is particularly important because of the rapid growth of the digital economy and the reliance on technology for essential services. I'm talking about everything from online banking and e-commerce to education and healthcare. However, across Africa, there is a noticeable lack of adoption of accessibility standards like the WCAG 2.1. Many websites and apps do not meet the basic accessibility requirements, which creates a significant barrier for millions of people with disabilities. And when we look at some of these barriers, we see a combination of poor infrastructure, low internet penetration, and a lack of policy enforcement on accessibility standards. For instance, in rural areas where internet penetration is already low, many people with disabilities are very disadvantaged. They may not even have access to the tools or services that they need to live more independently. And according to Statista, Africa's internet penetration rate is about 43.2% compared to 67.9% of the global average. And this means millions of people cannot access the basic digital tools we often take for granted, let alone accessible tools designed for those with disabilities. Let's take a look at some stats. About 10 to 15% of the African population live with disabilities, according to UNESCO. That's more than 80 million people in Africa. And now these more than 80 million people face a lot of challenges in accessing digital content and services. And this goes beyond physical spaces like public transportations or buildings, as most of us already know that digital platforms are becoming just as essential as physical infrastructure. And yet, millions of Africans are excluded from accessing online services because websites and apps are not designed with inclusivity in mind. And the stats to look at is less than 1% of government websites in sub-Saharan Africa fully comply with the WCAG standards. And this lack of compliance is a major barrier to digital inclusion for people with disabilities. As we know that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines provide a roadmap for making web content more accessible, and compliance with this standard is very essential. And the last step to take a look at is this one, like a recent audit of 15 mobile applications in Kenya. And these are apps for telecommunications and banking industries, found that none of them cater to people with disabilities. And this is a significant issue given the increasing reliance on mobile technology for essential services in Africa. Let's take a look at the general disability legislation in Africa. I'm focusing on 4 countries here: South Africa, Nigeria, and Morocco. Then we move to Kenya. Many African nations have enacted disability legislation, but the focus is mainly on physical accessibility, such as ensuring that public building and transportation are accessible. And unfortunately, digital accessibility is often overlooked in these laws, despite the increasing importance of online platforms in everyday life. For instance, the South Africa's white paper on the rights of persons with disabilities. It is a forward-thinking piece of legislation that addresses the full spectrum of accessibility needs for people with disabilities. It focuses on physical spaces, making public spaces like buildings and transportation more accessible, and improving services like education and healthcare for people with disabilities. However, one major shortcoming is the lack of focus on digital accessibility. And in a world that is becoming more digital every day, accessibility is not just about buildings and transport systems anymore, but also digital inclusion. And without specific provisions for digital platforms, people living with disabilities in South Africa are often left out of e-government services, online learning, online health, and even social services that are delivered online. And I confirmed this during an event I attended earlier this year. When I started on my research, I attended a dev conference, and I decided to speak to a few people, just like an interview for my research. Can't remember the number of people I spoke to, but If I say out of 10 people that I spoke to, and no, this was a developers conference, so most of the people I spoke to were developers and designers, generally people in the IT industry. So I'll say out of 10 people that I spoke to, 7 did not know about digital accessibility. And 2 out of 10 knows a bit about digital accessibility, but it's not implemented at work at all. And only one person that I spoke to actually knew a lot about digital accessibility. And the funny part is the one person that knew a lot about that was not even an IT engineer, a developer. They were a student who was still in uni, and they had someone speak to them about digital accessibility. So they decided to do more research on the other. The government communication site in South Africa also has a single page on website accessibility, requesting all South African government departments to address accessibility issues, but this is rarely followed. And this is a missed opportunity, especially as South Africa is a leading economy in Africa with a rapidly growing tech industry and the lack of digital accessibility standards in a country that takes inclusion very important. And we call ourselves the Rainbow Nation in South Africa. It should be a wake-up call for South African lawmakers. Another country to take a look at is Nigeria. And in 2018, Nigeria passed the Discrimination Against Persons with Disabilities Act. It was a landmark piece of legislation aimed at protecting the rights of people with disabilities. And the law provides for equal access to public services, education, healthcare, and employment. But like many other African countries, it also lacks a clear mandate when it comes to digital accessibility. There are no specific requirements for making website, online government services, or digital platforms accessible to people with disabilities. And this creates a significant barrier to inclusion, particularly for millions of Nigerians who rely on online banking, mobile apps, and e-government services for their day-to-day tasks. And in a country as digitally connected as Nigeria, which is also the most populated country in Africa with about 220 million people, if I'm correct. This also means, by the way, that Nigeria has the highest number of people living with disabilities in Africa. So this means that people with disabilities are left out of key services that are moving online, and that is a lot of people. While the physical infrastructure may be accessible, digital infrastructure often remains out of reach. Bridging this gap in Nigeria, where technology is also growing rapidly, is crucial for ensuring that no one is left behind. And the country I'm going to take a look at quick is Morocco. So Morocco's law 9730 also guarantees the rights of people with disabilities in public services, infrastructure, and especially employment. They think that's very important. But like the ones I've mentioned, it does not address digital accessibility. And this is a concerning gap as more public services and critical information move online. So from these 3 countries we've highlighted, we can see that the missing piece here is digital accessibility. And addressing this missing piece, that is, ensuring that digital platforms are accessible would not only improve the quality of life for millions, but also boost economic growth by including more people in the digital economy. Now, countries like Kenya, which has already introduced its ICT accessibility standard, are showing that it is possible, but the rest of the continent needs to follow. While digital accessibility is the missing piece in many African countries, Kenya has really proven that this gap can be filled by developing the first national ICT standard. They have set the benchmark for other African countries to follow. Let's take a look at Kenya's ICT accessibility standard. Yeah, so as I mentioned, Kenya has taken significant steps towards addressing digital accessibility by developing the ICT accessibility standard. I would say it is the first of its kind in Africa, and it's aligned with WCAG 2.1, ensuring that digital platforms, including website and mobile apps, are accessible to people with disabilities. It is a landmark achievement because It applies to both the public and private sectors. This means that not only government websites, but also e-commerce platforms, online banking, and other digital services must comply with these guidelines. And by making this a national standard, Kenya has basically set an example for the rest of Africa. And they're demonstrating that digital inclusion is possible when governments, businesses, and advocacy groups work together to create and enforce standards that are everyone, regardless of their abilities, access, and benefit from digital platforms. So I want to take a look at some of the key features of Kenya's standards. The three main features of Kenya standard is web accessibility and mobile application accessibility, and also the fact that it is compliance for public and private sector. The screen, for example, the screen reader compatibility that requires that website and mobile applications be compatible with screen readers. This is essential for visually impaired users. Also, keyboard navigation, which is particularly important for people with motor impairments who may be unable to use the mouse. Website and applications really need to be fully navigable using keyboard alone. And from my research, I realized that especially in South Africa, some websites, some people claim to have built platforms that are accessible, but one thing that is missing mostly is keyboard navigation. And I have tried to report this as much as I can, but it is a lot, and it is something that needs to be taken as a crucial point when discussing accessibility for platforms. Another is color contrast and text readability, which mandates that the use of appropriate color contrast to ensure that text is readable, even for people with low vision. And this means ensuring sufficient contrast between text and background colors, which makes content clearer and easier to read. Also, focusing on mobile application accessibility, the Kenya standard also focuses heavily on the accessibility of mobile apps. With the rise of mobile use across Africa, it is important that apps can be navigated by users with assistive technologies, such as voice commands, and that they integrate well with screen readers and other assistive tools. Also, the most remarkable thing about the Kenya standard is that it applies across both public and private sectors. As I mentioned earlier, it means that not only government website, but also e-commerce, banking, and healthcare platforms comply with these accessibility guidelines, ensuring that digital services are available to all. And by ensuring these features, Kenya is setting a stronger example of how digital platforms can be made more inclusive in Africa. These standards ensure that people with disability can fully participate in the digital economy. So next, I'm going to take a look at the impact of Kenya's ICT accessibility standard. All right, look, I'm going to take a look at how the standards came to be. So the development of Kenya's ICT standard, it was a collaborative effort driven by the need to improve digital inclusivity for people with disabilities. And it came about due to the growing recognition of barriers faced by people with disability in accessing essential digital platforms and services. One of the major players behind the development of the standards was a non-profit organization called Enable. They advocate for digital inclusion and empower the visually impaired with assistive technologies. For over a decade, Enable has been actively working to raise awareness about accessibility, especially digital accessibility for people with disabilities in Kenya. And the organization then partnered with the Kenya Bureau of Standards, KEBS, to push for the adoption of a formalized accessibility standard for ICT products and services. Another reason was due to the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. these standards came to be as a response to the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the significant digital divide, especially for people with disabilities. During the pandemic, a lot of services moved online, such as government services, education, healthcare, and e-commerce. And people with disabilities were really affected by inaccessible platforms. And this urgency was what helped drive the creation of the standard in Kenya to ensure that digital services, both in public and private sectors, are accessible to all. Also, the government and stakeholder collaboration, Kenya Ministry of ICT and the National Council of People with Disabilities were critical government bodies that work together with Enable and CAPS to develop the standard. So a broad range of stakeholders from academia, industry, civil society, and also especially individuals with disabilities were all involved to ensure the standard was comprehensive and that it addresses the real need of the population. The Kenya standard was also made to align with the globally recognized WCAG 2.1 guidelines, ensuring that website, mobile apps, and ICT products meet internationally accepted accessibility benchmarks. And this alignment helps ensure that the standard is robust and effective in creating inclusive digital environment. Next, I'm going to take a look at the impact of Kenya's digital accessibility efforts. The 5 main impact is that it has improved digital inclusion, educational access, economic empowerment, has set the benchmark for Africa, and has strengthened partnership. So how has it improved digital inclusion? The standard has directly enhanced access to digital platforms for people with disabilities, that is allowing them to participate more in digital economy and society. So accessible services like online banking, e-commerce, and government platforms are now more usable by people with disabilities, removing key barriers to participation. Also, in education, schools and services have now started adopting the standard, making online learning platforms more accessible to students with disabilities. And if I might say, this is one of the main issues during the pandemic, especially in South Africa, where a lot of schools moved online. The fact that many of the online learning platforms were not fully accessible to people with disabilities. So Kenya has made sure of this with the standard, and this has led to greater educational opportunities, especially for visually impaired students who now benefit from accessible resources. Another impact is economic empowerment. So by making digital services accessible, including financial services and employment platforms, the standard has enabled greater economic participation for people with disabilities. This has also boosted employment opportunities and allowed people with disabilities to engage in online commerce and other economic activities. It has also set a benchmark for Africa, as I mentioned. Kenya's standard serves as a model for other African nations, showing that comprehensive digital accessibility can be achieved in Africa. And other countries are beginning to consider, though not a lot and not as much as they should, but other countries are starting to look at what Kenya has done, and they're beginning to consider setting similar standards to ensure that their digital platforms are accessible. And last, it has strengthened partnerships, the collaboration between government bodies, private sector companies, advocacy groups like Enable, and people with disabilities has created a strong network for promoting digital accessibility. And these partnerships have driven ongoing improvement in the implementation of accessibility standards across sectors in Kenya. So that's about Kenya, but what are the general challenges in digital accessibility across Africa? I have listed 4 here, but there are more, but to me, these are the 4 main challenges in implementing digital accessibility in Africa. First is awareness and enforcement. A significant challenge is definitely lack of awareness. about accessibility standards. As I mentioned, that I spoke to a few people in the IT industry who do not know about digital accessibility. Many organizations, especially smaller ones, may not even be aware of existing guidelines like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Even where standards do exist, enforcement is often inconsistent. Government bodies and regulators have not always ensured compliance, meaning that many websites and digital services remain inaccessible to users with disability. A good example of this is the inconsistent enforcement of the South Africa's white paper on the rights of persons with disability. And this lack of awareness brings us to the next challenge, which is related to cost. Accessibility improvement often require significant investment, but in terms of finances and time. For smaller organizations and startups, the cost of implementing accessibility features, such as upgrading website for screen reader compatibility or ensuring proper color contrast, can be prohibitive. This leads to a situation where the cost becomes a barrier to accessibility. Larger organizations, however, with more resources might be able to bear this cost, but for smaller entities, it can be a bit harder. And even if the cost is not a barrier, there's still technology challenges to consider. In many parts of Africa, we face low internet penetration and outdated technology, particularly in rural areas. And this limits the rollout of digital accessibility features, as many of these require modern infrastructure and reliable internet connectivity. And this digital divide, especially in rural areas, further worsens the challenge, as people with disabilities in these regions may even have less access to accessible platforms. And finally, let's not forget the challenge around expertise, right? Another key challenge is the lack of expertise and the difficulty of conforming to standards. Many developers and ICT professionals are not trained in accessibility best practices. Again, from my interview with people where developers and designers do not know about digital accessibility. So even when organizations want to implement these features, they may not have the expertise to do so, which leads to partial or ineffective implementations. And one thing that I see happen a lot is the ineffective implementation of accessibility. Some people know about accessibility, but how do I implement it? When do I implement it? And the common mistake about accessibility from my research is when you implement accessibility, because it seems a lot of people only think about accessibility when they, for a website, for example, when they're done building their website, they're done with testing, SEO, and they're about to launch the website. That is when they think about accessibility, which leads to ineffective implementation. And furthermore, as with awareness, enforcement of conformance remains a challenge, which means that even when standards exist, not everyone is adhering to them. So, as you can see, addressing these challenges requires a complex approach. There's raising awareness, reducing costs, improving infrastructure, and providing the necessary training. But with these challenges also comes some opportunities, and we'll talk about that. So, what are the opportunities for Africa in the field of digital accessibility? First, I would say Kenya's accessibility standard has provided a solid foundation for other African nations to follow. By adopting Kenya's standard as a model, other countries can save both time and resources. So they don't need to reinvent the world. They don't need to start from scratch. Since there is a country in Africa that already has a standard and a concrete standard, they can build on Kenya's proven framework to create their own national digital accessibility standard. And this would create consistency across the continent if African countries build on one standard. Second is we also have the opportunity to strengthen legal frameworks. African countries can integrate the WCAG as Kenya has done into their national disability laws, ensuring digital accessibility becomes a legal requirement, and also introducing incentives and penalties for compliance. This is important. This will encourage public and private sectors to adopt accessible practices in digital platforms such as website and mobile apps. And these steps would pave the way for a more inclusive future where all users, including persons with disabilities, can benefit from digital revolution. Moving on is collaborative solutions. So one of the key steps forward in addressing digital accessibility is collaboration, as we've seen in the case of Kenya. This involves public-private partnerships, government, businesses, and advocacy groups coming together to ensure that private sector websites and apps are made accessible to everyone. As I mentioned, an example is the collaboration between Kenya's government and industries like banking, telecommunications, and advocacy groups. And this was crucial in implementing the ICT accessibility standard. Training is another essential solution. Governments and NGOs must invest in training developers and ICT professionals in digital accessibility standards. This is vital for the long-term sustainability of accessibility initiatives and will help future-proof digital projects to ensure that they serve all members of society. One thing that happens a lot in Africa, and I think a lot of people will probably agree to this in Africa, is the lack of training when the government tries to implement standards like this. And as I mentioned earlier, South Africa has this webpage on website accessibility, but it is not been adhered to. No one follows it. There is no training. There is no organization by the government that has put that there that actually tries to enforce this. So no training. It's just a standard that's there, but no one follows it, and nothing is being done to improve it. Moving on to future directions for Africa. So where do we go from there? We can say now that Africa has the real opportunity to move forward in the future of digital accessibility. And one of the ways to do this is by expanding digital accessibility initiatives across the continent. First, the African Union has a critical role to play. I'm not sure if anyone from the African Union will listen to this, but I hope to do that with my research. I hope to interview a lot of people and to try to get my research as far as it can go. As I said, African Union has a critical role to play. So by encouraging regional cooperation and promoting standardized digital accessibility regulations. So if this is a standard set by the African Union, then it is easier to make it reach every African country. So we can ensure that every country moves forward together and not just in pockets of progress. So now that Kenya has set one, then South Africa does it, and then Nigeria, it's just pockets of progress. But if the African Union is involved in this, and it's a standard set by the African Union, just like the EU has, then we all move forward together. So this will create a unified standard, making digital services accessible across national boundaries. Second is national ICT development plans should also prioritize accessibility. So we need to ensure that people with disabilities are included in the plans that shape Africa's digital future by embedding digital accessibility in our national strategies. So we not only foster inclusivity, but also bridge the digital divide and creating opportunities for our citizens to benefit from technology. And here's my conclusion. So at this point, I think we all now know the importance of taking action, and we know that digital accessibility is not just a recommendation, but it needs to be made a priority. And as we've seen, many African nations still lack comprehensive digital accessibility laws, which has created a gap where people with disabilities are excluded from vital services and information. So how do we close this gap? By prioritizing digital accessibility in both law and practice, just like Kenya has done with its ICT standard. We need similar frameworks to be adopted across the continents to ensure that no one is left behind. It's time to turn words into action, and that starts with everyone, each of us advocating for the changes we want to see. For example, what I'm trying to achieve with my research is to get it to reach as many disability advocacy groups in Africa as much as I can. There, there are a lot to reach, but my goal is to make sure my research actually reaches them. I think I've reached out to 3 or 4 in South Africa. I have spoken to them, and they were really excited about my research and really willing to collaborate. And I hope I will be able to reach others outside of South Africa, and I hope we will see a way forward from there. Also, it's not just the responsibility of governments, it is a collective effort that includes developers, businesses, and advocacy groups. So we all need to collaborate to make sure that website, mobile apps, and other digital services are accessible to all users, regardless of their disabilities. And by working together, we can create a more inclusive digital future for people with disabilities across Africa. So government can break laws, developers also have to ensure compliance, and advocacy groups can push for implementation and awareness. So thank you for your time and attention today. I hope this talk has informed you and also inspired you to take action on digital accessibility in Africa. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me via email or my website. I would really appreciate some input on my research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Femi Taiwo, for an amazing session. I just want to remind our listeners that they can ask questions in the Q&A session, right? We do have a question right now from John. John says, coming from a country that lacks enforcing digital accessibility, how can an individual or my company help to push this initiative forward?
Okay. I think the first thing is to learn more about accessibility standards. There is the WCAG 2.1, which is a global standard. So I think that's the first step, learning and also introducing that in the company. And to push the initiative forward, as I mentioned, I think one of the best ways reaching out to advocacy groups. I'm not sure what country you're from, but reaching out to advocacy groups and working with advocacy groups, and also spreading awareness, just like I'm doing now. I think spreading awareness is very important. So spreading awareness is the first thing to do to actually push this forward, and also reaching out to advocacy groups to work with them.
Thank you so much, Femi. We have another amazing question from Manto. And Manto says, as someone who has started an initiative to empower persons with disabilities in Africa, specifically Cameroon, what advice can you give to me on how to support or how to get support from the continent?
Great. I've also thought about this, as I'm working on my research. So how do I get support from the country? And as I mentioned, I reached out to some advocacy groups. There is this the WCAP, it's the Western Cape Association for People with Disabilities, and they have been very supportive. And because they are NGO that are more connected to the government, so they have been very supportive, and they have really tried to give me as more information that I need for my research, and they are willing to help in pushing this this case forward in the country. So I would say one of the ways to get support is also reaching out to advocacy groups. And you say you're from Cameroon. I haven't really checked on advocacy groups in Cameroon, but I am sure there are groups that you can work with in Cameroon.
Thank you so much, Femi. We have another question from Gerson, and they say, what's the general feedback and reception of businesses and website owners in Kenya regarding digital accessibility? Is it well received and implemented, or is there resistance?
Yes, it is. It is well received. There are some resistance. I mean, as there will also be, but as in the United States and in Europe, it is a standard and it is a law. So it is something you have to follow, or you will be penalized in some way. So even for those who do not want to follow you, like, it is very important. But also, sorry, but also, as I mentioned, that one of the reasons why this was pushed was due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and a lot of people actually could see a genuine and a good reason for implementing this standard. And also with the fact that, and I think someone has talked about this. I've also talked about this in my previous talk, is if there are standards and laws like this and you are not following them, you are basically not reaching people with disabilities. And if you're a business selling, maybe you sell online and you are not implementing the standard, it means you are not reaching about 15% of your customers. So I think these are the things that people actually get to think about, and then yeah, we have to follow this standard.
Okay, thank you so much, Femi. You have another question from Willem, and it says, in your research, have you found any information about accessibility initiatives or regulations in Nigeria? With Nigeria being the most populous country on the continent, it seems that initiatives here could have a lot of impact. And it says, apologies if you already missed it.
Yeah, I did mention this, but I'll go over it again. There are accessibility initiatives in Nigeria, but what I mentioned is the fact that the standards and laws in Nigeria do not really focus on digital accessibility. And I am also planning to reach out to initiatives in Nigeria with my research. And as you mentioned, with Nigeria being the most populous country, it's very important because Nigeria also has the highest number of people living with disabilities in Africa.
Okay, so thank you again, Femi. I think I have a personal question, but I can't seem to ask it in the chat, so I'll just ask. So my question is, what role can open source technology play in advancing digital accessibility in Africa?
Yes, I would say the role that open source technology can play is what we're doing now. What WordPress is doing in the IT industry. So what I've also tried to do is try to speak at events, and just in South Africa, there is an event that we have. It's called Do Action. I'm not sure if you know about it. So it is an event where we build websites for NGOs. And my plan, hopefully, for next year is, if we're going to have one again, we're going to focus mainly on accessibility. That is, look for NGO websites that like accessibility features and rebuild their website just for that. So I think these are one of the ways that open source communities can assist.
That's a great idea. Thank you so much again, Femi Taiwo, for an amazing presentation on improving and enforcing digital accessibility laws and standards in Nigeria. in Africa, sorry. Yes. So thank you everyone for attending this session with Femi Taiwo. You can continue the conversation in the chat or on social media using hashtag WPA11YDay and hashtag WPAD2024. We also appreciate it if you go to 2024.wpaccessibility.day/feedback to provide anonymous feedback for our speakers on their presentation. You can also enter to win a t-shirt while you're there. Who doesn't like a t-shirt? So yes, you can also enter to win a t-shirt while you're there. And don't forget to stay tuned and watch our ads. Stay prepared for the next speaker, which is Victoria Nduka. And she'll be coming on at exactly 9 a.m. UTC with her talk. Thank you.
Thank you to WordPress Accessibility Day 2024 sponsors. Platinum sponsor 20i. Easily build, deploy, and manage all your projects with 20i managed WordPress hosting. One UI for all your servers, apps, sites, databases, security, DNS, and email. Perfect for agencies, e-commerce, developers, multi-site hosting, and high-traffic sites. Platinum sponsor Equalize Digital. Since all they do is accessibility, every post on their blog is an accessibility resource. You can find webinar recordings, articles, and additional resources at equalizedigital.com/resources. Platinum sponsor WP Engine. WP Engine provides the most relied upon and trusted WordPress products for businesses, brands, and agencies of all sizes. Thanks to our gold sponsors, GoDaddy, Grackle Docs, Gravity Forms, Green Geeks, TPGI, and Yoast. And thank you to our silver sponsors, CodeGeek, Drake Cooper, Elementor, Overnight Website, Pressable, Second Melody, and Accessibility Collective.